So it would have been quite easy for me today not to pick the patronal festival readings for St Thomas and to choose something more traditionally Christmassy. But I wanted to think about Thomas this year because I think this past year that we've had have highlighted some of the key things which Thomas's story brings into a sharper focus. This year, of all years, we have been thinking as a United Kingdom and as separate nations about government, equality, justice, the ethos of a nation, and how that is reflected in the way it is governed. The coronavirus pandemic has let each nation observe other nations throughout the world, observe the way in which they have handled the health and welfare of their citizens. Then, of course, in November, we were able to watch the United States choose their new president, which has been and still remains an academically fascinating process, but one in which millions of people's lives are affected with a simple decision. At the same time, in the UK, we have been tussling with the final Brexit negotiations amidst the trials of deciding as a nation who should be protected from coronavirus and how. Some of you may be wondering by now why I wanted to talk about Thomas this morning. But in amongst the practical and theoretical preparations for this year's Christmas celebrations, and believe me, that's been quite interesting this year, doing the risk assessments for all the activities and then actually having members of the public email me to ask what our risk assessments are and whether they have indeed been done correctly, which has led me to recheck the guidelines and going back and talking to these people about things which are mandatory and things which are only strongly advised. But in amongst all this, I have been thinking about Thomas. Thomas was a commoner who was a very, very good administrator. He rose up through the political ranks and he was really, really good friends with King Henry. Then Henry made him Archbishop, and it seems that Henry maybe should have known in retrospect that such a thorough person as Thomas would take the job of Archbishop really seriously and do it very thoroughly. This meant that whilst King Henry, expected that he'd put Thomas on the episcopal throne in order to be Henry's friend, actually it had quite a different effect on Thomas. This is partly what I say about Thomas every year, but I say it with a new poignancy this year. When Henry made Thomas Archbishop, he expected Thomas to remain his subject, still loyal to Henry, still to take Henry's side, still to support Henry's government in any position or stance, to obey Henry's commands, to run the church according to Henry's ethos and ideals. This was a mistake on Henry's part. Partly, I suspect, because Thomas was such a serious and studious person. I think today the words geek or nerd might be applied to him in a good and not disparaging way. When Thomas became Archbishop, he was committed to a change. He was no longer Henry's subject, but God's subject. He became loyal to God, not to Henry. He would support God's side, not Henry's, in an argument. He would support God's commands and not Henry's, and Thomas would run the church according to God's ethos and ideals. We were so disappointed not to be able to go to Canterbury this year. I came within minutes of booking the accommodation for the pilgrimage in a non-refundable way. Then I just had a question I needed to check. And then within the 48 hours of me checking that question, it became clear that we wouldn't be going. But it was in Canterbury that Thomas and Henry's bitter arguments about Henry's expectation that Thomas should still be loyal to him, and Thomas's expectation that he should be unwaveringly loyal to God, came to their bloody earthly end on the floor of Canterbury Cathedral when some of Henry's knights went and murdered Thomas. And the canons of the cathedral allegedly have not brought themselves to clean up properly that spot for 850 years. So you can still see the exact place. 2020 has been the most remarkable year. We have been living through history, and it has been acutely uncomfortable. It has been a year full of grief, sadness, instability, and we have all had moments where we have asked questions about how we want to be governed, whose subject we want to be, whose side we are going to take in an argument, whose ethos and ideals we want to govern our lives and the church. How have we felt as God's subjects this year? How have we taken God's side in an argument of government? How have we asked God's questions about justice and equality and God's kingdom within our United Kingdom and our individual nations? And how are we going to do this in 2021? I suspect this is one of my usual sermons about Thomas, about his understanding that the citizenship of every Christian belongs in heaven and not on earth. My annual challenge of how our understanding of our citizenship of God's kingdom means we are God's subjects, and we should be working out what it means for us to be living in this earthly kingdom. Our UK passports remind us that we are subjects of Queen Elizabeth, which is true. We share Thomas's disquiet that we are truly God's subjects. This is disturbing and reassuring at the same time. We live here in these troublesome times, but when we die and leave the earth, we remain God's subjects with a place in his kingdom. Let Thomas be an inspiration to us. When we see our own government, let us ask questions. Is this what God's kingdom is like? As a citizen of God's kingdom, what should I be doing about this? It's a challenge and a reassurance that our lives are not limited here, but like Thomas, we will be welcomed home in due time to God's heavenly kingdom. Amen.